Isabella Santos was having the kind of morning that made her question every life choice she'd ever made. First, her alarm clock decided to take an unscheduled vacation at 4:30 a.m. Apparently 3 years of faithful service was its limit. Then, while rushing to catch the 5:15 bus, the seam of her only clean work pants split right down the back as she jumped over a puddle. "Perfect," she muttered, tying her blonde hair into a messy bun while walking backwards to the nearest 24-hour convenience store. Just absolutely perfect. 20 minutes and $15 she couldn't afford later, Isabella was speed walking to Salt and Pepper Diner, wearing bright purple sweatpants with "Sweet Dreams" written in glittery letters across the butt. The pants were 2 sizes too big and made swishing sounds with every step, but they were the only option that wouldn't get her fired for public indecency. She burst through the glass door at exactly 6:47 a.m., 47 minutes late, and looking like she'd lost a fight with a discount clothing rack. "Madonna mia!" Giuseppe Rossi emerged from the kitchen, took one look at her outfit, and started laughing so hard he had to lean against the counter. "Bella, you look like a unicorn exploded on you." "Don't say a word." Isabella grabbed her apron and tied it around her waist, hoping it was long enough to hide the worst of the glittery disaster. "I've had a morning that would make Satan himself weep." "Bambina, you're never late. Never. In 3 years, you've been more punctual than Swiss trains." Giuseppe wiped tears from his eyes. "What happened?" "My alarm clock died, my pants committed suicide, and the only store open was apparently run by teenage girls with questionable fashion sense." She flipped on the grill and started organizing ingredients with military precision. "But I'm here. I'm dressed. Sort of. And I'm ready to flip burgers, like my life depends on it." "Actually, Bella." Giuseppe's expression shifted to something she'd never seen before. Nervous excitement mixed with paternal worry. "After lunch, we need to talk. It's about something I should have told you a long time ago." Isabella paused in arranging the burger patties. "Should I be worried? Because honestly, Giuseppe, I can't handle any more surprises today. I'm already dressed like a walking cotton candy advertisement." "It's good news, I think." He scratched his graying head. "Maybe. We'll see." Before Isabella could ask what that cryptic response meant, the breakfast rush hit like a tsunami. She spent the next 4 hours flipping eggs, grilling bacon, and taking orders while trying to ignore the fact that her sweatpants made her sound like a walking maraca every time she moved. At 11:43 a.m., just as the morning chaos was winding down, the sky opened up like someone had torn a hole in the universe. Rain pounded against the windows with the fury of an angry god, and Isabella found herself staring outside while absently wiping down the counter. That's when she saw it. A sleek, silver Aston Martin hydroplaning down the street like it was auditioning for a Fast and Furious movie. The car spun twice, clipped a fire hydrant, and came to a screeching halt, diagonal across 2 parking spaces directly in front of the diner. "Jesus Christ," Isabella breathed, dropping her rag. "Someone's either having a worse day than me, or they're completely insane." The driver's door flew open, and a man stumbled out into the downpour. Even from 50 feet away and through sheets of rain, Isabella could see he was tall, blonde, and moving with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing the apocalypse. He sprinted toward the diner like his life depended on it, yanked the door open so hard the little bell above it practically screamed, and stood there dripping on her freshly mopped floor, chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Isabella stared. The man was gorgeous in that expensive, untouchable way that usually made her roll her eyes. Designer suit plastered to his body, dark blonde hair dripping water onto what were probably $1,000 shoes, and green eyes that held a wild, almost panicked look. "Please," he gasped, gripping the counter like it was a life preserver. "Please tell me you serve real food here." Isabella blinked twice, suddenly very aware of her ridiculous sweatpants, and the fact that she probably looked like she'd escaped from a fever dream. Real food. Food that doesn't require a PhD to understand. Food that doesn't come with a side of pretension and a lecture about molecular gastronomy. He ran his hands through his wet hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. food that actual human beings might recognize as edible. Despite her mortification over her outfit, Isabella found herself fighting back a smile. Well, our menu isn't exactly sophisticated. Thank God. He collapsed onto a stool at the counter like he'd been wandering the desert for days. Look, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I haven't had a decent meal in 3 days. Everything I've eaten has tasted like expensive cardboard arranged by people who've never actually been hungry. There was something in his voice, a raw desperation that went beyond simple hunger. Isabella studied his face and saw exhaustion, frustration, and underneath it all, a sadness so deep it made her chest tight. 3 days? She asked softly. I'm doing research, visiting every restaurant in the city. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out when you're looking for food that actually has soul, you're pretty much screwed in this town. Something about the word soul hit Isabella right in the chest. She knew that feeling, the emptiness that came from going through the motions without any real purpose behind them. Okay, she said, untying her apron. But you have to trust me. At this point, I'd trust anyone who doesn't use foam as a primary ingredient. Isabella laughed, really laughed, for the first time all day. Stay right there, and try not to judge the sweatpants too harshly. It's been a hell of a morning. She turned toward the grill, but instead of reaching for the standard frozen patties, she opened Giuseppe's special freezer and pulled out the fresh ground beef he prepared daily. Instead of the industrial buns, she grabbed one of the homemade rolls he baked every morning before dawn, and instead of the basic seasonings, she reached for the secret blend he'd taught her, the one that smelled like memory and tasted like love. As the meat sizzled on the grill, Isabella caught the stranger's reflection in the polished steel backsplash. His eyes were closed, and he was breathing deeply, like the smell was calling up something long forgotten. "What's your name?" she asked, flipping the burger with practiced precision. "Marco." He opened his eyes and caught her watching him in the reflection. "And you're Isabella, according to your name tag." Wow, detective skills for the win. She assembled the burger with careful attention. Toasted bun brushed with garlic butter, perfectly cooked meat, aged cheddar melted just right, caramelized onions she'd prepped at dawn, thick-cut tomato, crisp lettuce. Simple ingredients, but prepared with the technique Giuseppe had spent 3 years teaching her. When she placed the plate in front of him, Marco just stared at it for a long moment. "It's nothing fancy," Isabella said quickly, suddenly self-conscious. "Just a burger." He took his first bite and went completely still. Chewed slowly, eyes closed again. Then, to Isabella's absolute horror, a single tear rolled down his cheek. "Oh God, what did I do wrong?" She rushed around the counter. "Is it bad? Did I oversalt it? Is the meat off?" Marco shook his head, still chewing. When he finally swallowed, he looked at her with an intensity that made her take a step back. "When was the last time someone cooked for you because they wanted you to be happy?" The question caught her completely off guard. What do you mean?" "This burger." He held it up like it was something precious. "You didn't just cook it. You cared whether I'd like it. I can taste it in every bite." Isabella felt her cheeks heat up. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just food." "No." Marco took another bite, savoring it. "This is what food is supposed to be. This is what I've been looking for." Before Isabella could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Giuseppe appeared, looking unusually serious. "Bella, I need to talk to you. Now." "I'm with a customer, Giuseppe." "Now, bambina, it's about the food truck." Isabella frowned. Giuseppe had never mentioned owning a food truck. "What food truck?" The old Italian looked at Marco, then back at her, then sighed like a man carrying the weight of the world. "The one I'm leaving you." Thunder crashed outside, rattling the windows. Isabella looked at Giuseppe, then at Marco, who had stopped eating and was watching the exchange with obvious curiosity. and felt like her entire world was about to shift on its axis. "The one you're leaving me," she repeated slowly. Giuseppe wiped his hands on his apron and gestured toward the back office. "Sit down, Bella. We have a lot to discuss." Isabella followed Giuseppe into his cramped office, her glittery sweatpants making suspicious swishing sounds with every step. Through the small window that connected the office to the dining area, she could see Marco still sitting at the counter, methodically working his way through what was apparently the best burger of his life. "Giuseppe, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, dropping into the rickety chair across from his desk. "You've never mentioned a food truck, ever. And now, suddenly, you're leaving me one." The old man opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been there since the Carter administration. His hands were shaking slightly as he set it on the desk between them. "Bella, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to sound crazy." He took off his reading glasses and cleaned them nervously. "But I'm dying." Isabella's world tilted sideways. "What?" "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months if I'm lucky." Giuseppe held up a hand as Isabella started to speak. "Before you ask, no, there's nothing they can do. And no, I don't want your pity. I've had a good life, and I'm ready." "Giuseppe," Isabella's voice came out as a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have worried, and worry makes terrible seasoning." He smiled sadly. "But now I need to tell you about something I should have shared a long time ago. About why I hired you 3 years ago." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. "What do you mean?" Giuseppe opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of yellowed photographs. The top one showed a much younger version of himself standing next to a woman with kind eyes and Isabella's exact shade of blonde hair. "This is my Rosa. We were married for 43 years before she passed." His voice grew soft. "We tried for children for decades, but it wasn't meant to be. Then, 5 years ago, Rosa made me promise something on her deathbed." He flipped to the next photo, a beautiful vintage food truck painted in cheerful red and white stripes, with Rosa's Kitchen written in elegant script on the side. "She made me promise to find someone worthy of her dream. Someone who cooked with heart, not just skill. Someone who understood that food is love made edible." Giuseppe looked up at Isabella with tears in his eyes. "The day you walked in here with your resume written on a napkin, talking about wanting to feed people's souls, I knew Rosa had sent you to me." Isabella felt like someone had knocked all the air out of her lungs. "I don't understand." The food truck was Rosa's project. She spent 2 years designing it, collecting recipes from her nonna in Sicily, planning every detail. She wanted to travel the country, bringing real Italian food to people who'd never tasted anything but chain restaurant garbage. Giuseppe pulled out another photo showing the truck's gleaming interior. "But she got sick before we could make it happen." "Giuseppe, this is..." Isabella shook her head, overwhelmed. "This is too much. I can't accept something like this." "You can. And you will," he said firmly. "Because there's a condition." Of course there was. Isabella braced herself. "What kind of condition?" Giuseppe pulled out a thick folder filled with legal documents. "The truck comes with Rosa's complete recipe collection. Over 200 dishes passed down through 5 generations of Italian grandmothers. But according to her will, you can only inherit everything if you're married." Isabella blinked. "I'm sorry. What now?" Rosa believed that cooking with love required understanding love. She was very traditional. Giuseppe looked slightly embarrassed. She specified that the inheritor must be married within 6 months of receiving the truck, and stay married for at least a year to prove the recipes are in safe hands. "That's..." Isabella searched for words. "That's completely insane." "I know, Bambina. But Rosa was convinced that only someone who truly understood partnership could carry on her legacy." Giuseppe spread out the legal papers. "The good news is, the marriage just has to be legal." It doesn't specify anything about romance or living arrangements. Isabella stared at the photos of the beautiful food truck, her mind racing. This was everything she'd ever dreamed of. A chance to cook real food, to build something meaningful, to escape the endless cycle of frozen patties and processed cheese. But marriage? To a stranger? In 6 months? There has to be another way, she said weakly. I've had 3 lawyers look at this, Bella. Rosa was very thorough. Giuseppe leaned forward. But think about it. You could have your own business. Real ingredients, real recipes, real customers who appreciate good food. Isn't that worth a temporary arrangement? Through the office window, Isabella could see Marco still at the counter, now talking animatedly on his phone. As she watched, he gestured emphatically with his free hand, nearly knocking over his water glass. What if I can't find anyone willing to do it? She asked. Giuseppe followed her gaze and smiled mysteriously. Funny you should ask. What do you mean? That man out there, the one who cried over your hamburger. He's been coming in every day for the past week, always ordering the same thing, always asking if you made it personally. Giuseppe's eyes twinkled. Yesterday, he left a $50 tip on a $12 meal. Isabella felt her cheeks heat up. He's been coming in all week? I've never seen him before. You work the morning shift. He comes for lunch. Giuseppe pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. Marco sitting at the exact same stool, looking just as mysterious and expensive as he did now. Yesterday, I asked him what he does for work. And? He's a food critic. Marco Wellington. Writes for that fancy magazine, Culinary Quarterly. Apparently, he's one of the most influential food writers in the country. Giuseppe grinned. And he's completely obsessed with your cooking. Isabella's jaw dropped. He's a food critic? And I served him a diner burger in my pajama pants? The best burger he's had in years, according to what he told me. Giuseppe stood up and walked to the window. Bella, what if this isn't a coincidence? What if Rosa really did send you exactly what you need? Before Isabella could respond, there was a commotion from the dining room. Through the window, they saw Marco suddenly stand up, his phone pressed to his ear, his face pale with shock. What? No, that can't be right, they heard him say. I specifically told her. When did this happen? Giuseppe and Isabella exchanged glances as Marco began pacing, running his hands through his still damp hair. Fine, fine, but I'm not coming back to New York just to clean up another one of her messes. Marco's voice rose to a level that made the other customers look up from their meals. Tell Valentina she can handle her own publicity disasters for once. He hung up and stood there for a moment, staring at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. Then he turned and caught Isabella watching him through the office window. Their eyes met for a long moment, and Isabella felt something electric pass between them. Even from across the room, she could see the frustration and exhaustion in his expression, the same feelings she'd been carrying for 3 years. Giuseppe, she said slowly, not breaking eye contact with Marco. Tell me more about this marriage requirement. The old man's smile could have powered the entire diner. I thought you might be interested. But first, don't you think you should go see if your customer needs anything? He looks like a man who could use a friend right about now. Isabella looked down at her ridiculous sweatpants, then back at Marco, who was now slumped over the counter like the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. Right, she said, standing up and smoothing down her glittery pants. I should probably check on him. You know, customer service and all. Of course, Giuseppe agreed solemnly. Customer service. That's definitely what this is about. Isabella shot him a look that could have melted steel, then walked back into the dining room, her heart pounding with possibilities she wasn't quite ready to name. Marco looked up as she approached, and for the first time since he'd crashed into her life an hour ago, he smiled. A real, genuine smile that made her forget all about her ridiculous outfit. Everything okay? She asked, refilling his water glass. Actually, Marco said, his green eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I think it might be, for the first time in a very long time. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. Good. That's good. Isabella? Marco's voice was softer now, almost hesitant. This might sound forward, but would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Somewhere that isn't here, where I can return the favor and buy you a meal for once? Behind the office window, Giuseppe was practically vibrating with excitement, giving her enthusiastic thumbs up. Isabella looked at Marco, this mysterious, expensive, damaged man who'd crashed into her life on the same day she'd learned about Rosa's impossible inheritance. She thought about the food truck, about the recipes, about the marriage requirement that had seemed so insane just minutes ago. Actually, she said, surprising herself with her boldness, I might have a better idea, but it's going to sound completely crazy. Marco's smile widened. Lady, I just drove through a hurricane to eat gas station food because I was desperate for something real. Try me. Isabella took a deep breath, looked back at Giuseppe's encouraging nod, and decided to take the biggest leap of her life. How do you feel about food trucks? Marco Wellington stared at Isabella like she'd just suggested they rob a bank together. Food trucks? Hear me out, Isabella said quickly, sliding onto the stool next to him. The close proximity made her acutely aware that he smelled like expensive cologne and rain, while she probably smelled like grease and desperation. This is going to sound insane, but I just inherited a food truck. Well, sort of inherited. There's a catch. There's always a catch, Marco said, but his tone was curious rather than dismissive. What kind of catch? Isabella glanced back at Giuseppe, who was now pretending to organize receipts while obviously eavesdropping. She lowered her voice. I have to be married within 6 months to claim the inheritance, and stay married for a year. Marco's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. I'm sorry, what? I know how it sounds, but this isn't just any food truck. It comes with over 200 authentic Italian recipes passed down through 5 generations. We're talking about the kind of food that could change everything. Isabella's words came out in a rush. And you're a food critic who clearly knows quality when he tastes it, so you'd understand the value of something like this. Are you? Marco set down his burger and turned to face her fully. Are you asking me to marry you? The word marry hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Isabella felt her face turn approximately 17 shades of red. Not marry, she said quickly. More like a business arrangement, a partnership. You need authentic food experiences for your work, and I need a husband on paper. It could be mutually beneficial. Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. You don't even know me. I know you drove through a thunderstorm to find real food. I know you cried over a hamburger because someone actually cared whether you enjoyed it. I know you're frustrated with the pretentious food scene in this city. Isabella met his gaze steadily. And I know you're running from something, or you wouldn't have looked so panicked when you answered that phone call. Observant, Marco murmured. What makes you think I'd even consider something this crazy? Before Isabella could answer, the diner's front door chimed, and a woman walked in who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of Vogue. Tall, elegant, with perfectly styled black hair and a designer coat that probably cost more than Isabella made in 3 months. She scanned the diner with barely concealed disdain until her eyes landed on Marco. There you are, she said, her voice carrying a slight accent Isabella couldn't place. I've been calling you for hours. Marco's entire body tensed. Valentina, what are you doing here? Cleaning up your mess as usual. Valentina approached their corner of the counter, her heels clicking ominously on the worn linoleum. We need to talk, privately. Isabella started to stand, but Marco caught her wrist gently. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Isabella. Valentina's dark eyes flicked to Isabella dismissively, taking in the glittery sweatpants and work-worn hands. How charming. I didn't realize you'd started slumming it quite this literally. Excuse me? Isabella's voice went dangerously quiet. Valentina, Marco warned. No, it's fine, Isabella said, standing to her full height. She might be wearing ridiculous pants and smelling like burger grease, but she dealt with plenty of entitled customers over the years. Let me guess, You're the type of person who sends back perfectly good food because it doesn't come with enough garnish, right? Valentina's smile was sharp as a knife. I'm the type of person who owns 3 Michelin-starred restaurants and employs people like you to clean my kitchens. Then you're exactly the type of person who's ruining food in this city, Isabella shot back. All presentation, no soul. Isabella, Marco said. But there was admiration in his voice rather than warning. Valentina's composure cracked slightly. Marco, we really need to discuss the Wellington situation. Your father's been calling. At the mention of his father, Marco's face went completely blank. I told you, I'm done with all that. You can't just walk away from a $50 million empire because you're having some sort of quarter-life crisis, Valentina hissed. The board is breathing down our necks, and without your input on the expansion plans, I said I'm done. Marco's voice was ice cold. Find someone else to be your puppet. Isabella looked between them, pieces clicking into place. Wellington, as in Wellington Restaurant Group? Marco's jaw tightened. Among other things. Oh my God, Isabella breathed. You're that Wellington, the billionaire restaurant heir who disappeared from New York society pages 6 months ago. Guilty as charged, Marco said bitterly. Although disappeared is a strong word. I prefer strategic retreat from soul-crushing family expectations. Valentina laughed harshly. Strategic retreat? You mean running away like a child because you couldn't handle the pressure of actually working for once in your privileged life? That's enough. Marco stood abruptly, pulling out his wallet. He threw $200 bills on the counter, enough to cover his burger about 15 times over. Isabella, thank you for the meal. And the conversation. Valentina, you can tell my father that if he wants to discuss business, he can call me himself instead of sending his attack dog. He headed for the door, but Isabella caught up with him in 3 quick strides. Wait, she said, grabbing his arm. My offer still stands. Marco turned, rain already starting to soak through his expensive shirt again. You want to fake marry a runaway billionaire with daddy issues and a psychotic business partner? Are you insane? Probably, Isabella admitted. But think about it. You want to escape your family's expectations and discover authentic food. I want to build something real with recipes that have been perfected over generations. We could help each other. Behind them, Valentina was watching through the window with narrowed eyes, her phone pressed to her ear. She's not going to give up, Marco said, noticing Isabella's gaze. My family doesn't accept failure or defection gracefully. Then maybe it's time to give them something they really can't control, Isabella said boldly. Marry a diner waitress from Queens and start a food truck business. I bet that would shut them up for a while. Marco stared at her for a long moment, rain dripping from his hair. Then, to her complete surprise, he started laughing. You're absolutely crazy, he said. Is that a yes? That's a... Let me think about it while I figure out how to explain to my therapist that I'm considering entering a marriage of convenience with someone I met 4 hours ago. Marco pulled out his phone. Give me your number. If I decide to completely lose my mind, I'll call you. Isabella rattled off her digits, then watched him program them into what was definitely the most expensive phone she'd ever seen. Isabella Santos, he said, testing out her name. If we do this, and I'm not saying we will, but if we do, you should know that my life is complicated. My family has money, power, and very strong opinions about who I should marry. Good thing this wouldn't be real then, Isabella said, though something in her chest tightened at the words. Right, Marco agreed, though his eyes lingered on her face in a way that made her pulse quicken. Not real at all. He climbed into his Aston Martin and drove away, leaving Isabella standing in the rain in her ridiculous sweatpants, wondering if she'd just made the best or worst decision of her life. When she turned around, Giuseppe was standing in the doorway with the biggest grin she'd ever seen. So, he said cheerfully, when's the wedding? Giuseppe, Isabella warned. I'm just saying, Bambina. Rosa always did have excellent timing. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Isabella felt a warm breeze despite the storm, and for just a moment, she could swear she smelled rosemary and basil on the wind. Maybe Giuseppe was right. Maybe Rosa really had sent her exactly what she needed. She just hoped she'd survive long enough to find out. Isabella's phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., 3 days after the most surreal conversation of her life. She was lying in her tiny studio apartment, wearing her least embarrassing pajamas, pink with small tacos on them, trying to convince herself that Marco Wellington had definitely come to his senses and would never call. She grabbed the phone without looking at the caller ID. "Hello? Is this Isabella Santos, professional marriage proposer and destroyer of my carefully planned mental breakdown?" Despite everything, Isabella smiled. "Marco? I've been sitting in my car outside a 24-hour coffee shop for the past 2 hours trying to talk myself out of calling you," he said. "Unfortunately, I appear to have failed." Isabella sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Where are you?" "About 3 blocks from your apartment, according to the address Giuseppe may have given me when I stopped by the diner earlier today." There was a pause. "Is that creepy?" "That feels creepy. I should have asked first." "It's definitely creepy," Isabella agreed, but she was already pulling on jeans. "Lucky for you, I happen to be awake and in desperate need of caffeine." "Which coffee shop?" "Moonlight Diner on 5th Street. The one that looks like it hasn't been cleaned since the Carter administration." "I know the place. Give me 10 minutes." Isabella hung up and stared at herself in the bathroom mirror. Her blonde hair was doing its best impression of a bird's nest. She had grease stains on her taco pajama shirt, and there were bags under her eyes from 3 nights of stress-induced insomnia. "Perfect," she muttered, throwing on a hoodie and hoping the dim lighting at Moonlight Diner would hide the worst of it. She found Marco in a corner booth, looking like a Calvin Klein ad even at midnight. He'd changed out of his rain-soaked suit into dark jeans and a gray sweater that probably cost more than her rent. But somehow he seemed more real than he had in the diner. More human. "You came," he said, standing as she approached. "You bought me dinner once. I figured I owed you coffee." Isabella slid into the booth across from him. "So, have you decided whether you want to completely lose your mind?" Marco laughed, running a hand through his hair. "Straight to the point. I like that." He signaled the waitress for another coffee. "I've spent the last 3 days making lists of reasons why this is a terrible idea. And I ran out of paper." Marco's green eyes met hers across the table. "But then I realized something. Every reason on that list was someone else's voice in my head. My father, Valentina, my therapist, society in general telling me what I should and shouldn't do." The waitress brought Isabella's coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the warm mug gratefully. "What did your voice say?" "My voice said that 3 days ago, I ate the best meal I've had in 2 years, cooked by someone who actually gave a damn whether I enjoyed it. My voice said that I've spent the last 6 months running from my family's expectations, but I haven't been running toward anything." Marco leaned forward. "My voice said that maybe it's time to build something real, instead of just destroying what I don't want." Isabella felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with caffeine. So, I called my lawyer this afternoon and had him draw up a contract." Marco pulled a folder from the messenger bag beside him. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. No misunderstandings, no complications, no one getting hurt, because we didn't establish boundaries." Isabella opened the folder and found herself looking at a document that was somehow both thoroughly professional and completely insane. "Partnership Agreement for Marriage of Convenience and Joint Business Venture," she read aloud. "You actually did it. Clause 1. Marriage duration of exactly 1 year and 1 day, terminating automatically unless both parties agree in writing to extend," Marco said, pointing to the relevant section. Clause 2. Separate living arrangements unless specifically agreed upon for business purposes. Clause 3. Complete financial transparency regarding all food truck operations. Isabella flipped through the pages, marveling at the thoroughness. Clause 7. Both parties agree that this arrangement is strictly business, and that any romantic complications will be addressed through open communication and, if necessary, early contract termination. I wanted to be clear about expectations, Marco said, though his cheeks reddened slightly. Right, Isabella agreed, though she couldn't help noticing how his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. Strictly business. There's also Clause 12, Marco continued. I provide initial capital for food truck renovation and operation, up to $50,000, in exchange for equal partnership in the business and full access to the recipe collection for my writing. Isabella nearly dropped her coffee. $50,000? Food trucks aren't cheap to outfit properly, and if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Marco's expression grew more serious. But there's something else we need to discuss. My family is going to hate this. They're going to try to destroy you, the business, probably this entire neighborhood out of spite. Bring it on, Isabella said with more confidence than she felt. I'm serious, Isabella. They have more money than most small countries and fewer scruples than the average supervillain. My father once had a journalist fired for writing that his salmon was overcooked. And I once made a health inspector cry by pointing out that his critique of our fryer oil was based on outdated regulations he hadn't bothered to research. Isabella grinned. I'm tougher than I look. Marco studied her for a long moment, then smiled. A real, warm smile that made her forget they were sitting in a dingy, all-night diner. You know what? I believe you. He pulled out an expensive pen and signed his name at the bottom of the contract with a flourish. Isabella Santos, will you marry me for completely practical reasons that have nothing to do with how beautiful you look, even when you're wearing pajamas under your hoodie? Isabella felt her face burn. You notice the pajamas. Hard to miss the tacos. They're very cheerful. Marco slid the contract across to her. Is that a yes? Isabella looked down at the document that would change her entire life. In 12 hours, she'd gone from serving hamburgers in a dying diner to potentially owning a food truck business with one of the most influential food critics in the country. A food critic who happened to be gorgeous, wealthy, and looking at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. She picked up the pen. Just so we're clear, you realize I have no idea what I'm doing, right? I've never run a business, never been married, and never dealt with billionaire families bent on destruction. Neither have I, Marco admitted. Well, except for the billionaire family part, but that's what makes it interesting. Isabella signed her name next to his, her handwriting looking almost childish compared to his elegant script. When do we tell Giuseppe? I already did. He cried for 20 minutes and then started planning the menu for our wedding reception. Marco grinned. Apparently he's been hoping for this since the day you started working there. Of course he has. Isabella shook her head, laughing despite the surreal situation. When do we make it legal? I made an appointment at City Hall for Friday afternoon. Nothing fancy, just the basic ceremony with 2 witnesses. Marco paused. Unless you wanted something more traditional? God, no. The last thing this situation needs is more complications. Isabella extended her hand across the table. Partners. Marco shook her hand, his fingers warm and slightly calloused in a way that surprised her. Partners. Though I should probably warn you, I have no idea how to be married, even fake married. Lucky for you, I'm an excellent teacher, Isabella said, then immediately realized how that sounded. I mean, not about marriage, about cooking and business and normal people things. Normal people things? You know, grocery shopping, doing laundry, eating food that doesn't require a sommelier to explain. Isabella pulled her hand back, trying to ignore the way her skin tingled where he'd touched it. Rich people things are different from normal people things. I'm about to find out, Marco said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd just agreed to settling between them. Outside, the city hummed with late-night energy, and Isabella found herself wondering what Rosa would think of this bizarre turn of events. Marco, she said finally. Yeah? If this goes completely sideways and we end up hating each other, at least we'll have some good stories to tell. Marco's smile was bright enough to power the entire diner. Isabella Santos, I think you might be the best decision I've ever made. As he said it, Isabella felt something shift in her chest. Something dangerous and warm that had nothing to do with their business arrangement and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Strictly business, she reminded herself under her breath. Absolutely, Marco agreed, though his eyes said something entirely different. Neither of them mentioned that the contract didn't cover what to do if the fake marriage started feeling a little too real. Isabella stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of City Hall and wondered if it was possible to have a panic attack while wearing the only dress she owned. The navy blue sundress had seemed perfectly appropriate when she'd bought it 2 years ago for her cousin's graduation. But now, 15 minutes before her wedding to a billionaire she'd known for less than a week, it felt woefully inadequate. It's not a real wedding, she told her reflection firmly. It's a business transaction, in a dress, with witnesses, and legally binding vows. Her reflection looked unconvinced. A knock on the bathroom door made her jump. Isabella, you okay in there? Marco's voice carried a note of concern that shouldn't have made her pulse quicken, but absolutely did. Fine, she called back, voice pitched higher than usual. Just making sure I still have all my organs. You know, wedding jitters. We can still call this off if you want, Marco said through the door. No pressure. We'll find another way to get you that food truck. Isabella opened the door to find him leaning against the opposite wall, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of GQ in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His blonde hair was styled just messy enough to look effortless, and his green eyes held a warmth that made her forget this was supposed to be purely practical. You clean up nice, she said, smoothing down her dress self-consciously. So do you. Marco's gaze traveled from her face to her simple heels and back up again, lingering in a way that made her skin tingle. Blue is definitely your color. It's the only dress I own, Isabella admitted. Then it's perfect. Marco straightened his tie nervously. Giuseppe's already inside, crying into his handkerchief. I think he's more emotional about this than either of us. And the other witness? Marco's expression darkened slightly. My lawyer, David Chen. He flew in from New York this morning. Fair warning, he's going to spend the entire ceremony mentally calculating how much this could cost me in a hypothetical divorce. Charming. Isabella checked her lipstick one more time. Any word from your family? Radio silence, which is somehow more terrifying than screaming phone calls. Marco offered her his arm. Ready to become Mrs. Wellington for the next year and 1 day. Isabella looked at his extended arm, then up at his face. For just a moment, she let herself imagine this was real. That she was marrying someone who loved her, who wanted to build a life with her, who wasn't going to disappear the moment their contract expired. Then she remembered the food truck, the recipes, and the fact that this gorgeous, complicated man was her ticket to everything she'd ever dreamed of. Ready, she said, taking his arm. The ceremony itself lasted exactly 12 minutes and felt both eternal and over in a heartbeat. Isabella found herself standing in front of a bored-looking officiant, Giuseppe weeping openly in the first row while a stern-faced lawyer took notes, promising to love, honor, and cherish a man she barely knew. When Marco said his vows, his voice was steady and professional, but his eyes never left her face. When the officiant asked if she took Marco to be her lawfully wedded husband, Isabella heard herself say, I do, with more conviction than she'd expected. And when Marco kissed her, a brief, chaste press of lips that was meant to be purely ceremonial, Isabella felt something electric shoot through her entire body. Ladies and gentlemen, the officiant announced, I present Mr. and Mrs. Wellington. Giuseppe's sob echoed through the small room. 20 minutes later, they were standing outside City Hall in the afternoon sunshine, officially married and completely unsure what to do next. So, Marco said, loosening his tie. That happened, Isabella agreed, staring at the simple gold band on her left ring finger. Marco had surprised her with rings that morning. Nothing elaborate, just classic bands that looked like they'd belonged together forever. Mrs. Wellington, Giuseppe said, appearing at her elbow with red-rimmed eyes and the biggest smile she'd ever seen. How does it feel? Surreal, Isabella admitted. Like I'm going to wake up any minute and find out this was all a very detailed stress dream. David Chen approached with his briefcase and the expression that suggested he'd just witnessed the business equivalent of a natural disaster. Marco, we need to discuss the implications of this marriage for your trust fund, and your father has been calling every 10 minutes for the past hour. Let him call, Marco said firmly. David, meet my wife, Isabella. Isabella, David, the man who thinks I've completely lost my mind. It's not personal, David said, shaking Isabella's hand with the enthusiasm of someone handling evidence at a crime scene. I just like my clients to make informed decisions. What's the verdict? Isabella asked. How much trouble are we in? David consulted his tablet. Legally, you're bulletproof. The prenup is airtight, the business partnership is clearly defined, and the marriage contract covers every possible scenario I could think of. He paused. Practically speaking, you've just declared war on one of the most powerful families on the East Coast. Bring it on, Isabella said, with more bravado than she felt. As if summoned by her words, Marco's phone began ringing. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. Speak of the devil, he muttered, showing them the display. Dad. Answer it, Isabella said. We can't avoid them forever. Marco took a deep breath and swiped to accept the call. Hello, Father. Even from 3 feet away, Isabella could hear the explosive voice on the other end. Giuseppe and David exchanged uncomfortable glances while Marco held the phone away from his ear. Are you out of your mind? Charles Wellington's voice carried clearly across the sidewalk. A diner waitress? Marco, what have you done? I got married, Marco said calmly. I believe congratulations are traditional in these situations. This is not a joke. Do you have any idea what the board is going to say? What the press is going to do with this? You've embarrassed this family for the last time. Isabella watched Marco's jaw tighten and made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophic. She stepped closer and spoke loudly enough for the phone to pick up her voice. Mr. Wellington, this is Isabella, your new daughter-in-law. I just wanted to say thank you for raising such a wonderful man. The silence on the other end was deafening. Who? Charles Wellington's voice was dangerously quiet now. Who is this? Your son's wife, Isabella said sweetly. We're so looking forward to meeting you in person soon. Marco, his father's voice was ice cold now. Bring her to dinner Sunday night, 7 o'clock, and pray she's more impressive in person than she sounds on the phone. The line went dead. Marco stared at his phone, then at Isabella. Did you just invite yourself to dinner with my family? I figured we'd have to face them eventually. Might as well get it over with. Isabella tried to project confidence she definitely didn't feel. How bad could it be? Giuseppe, David, and Marco all stared at her with expressions that clearly said she had no idea what she'd just gotten herself into. Famous last words, David muttered. Isabella, Marco said carefully, my family doesn't just have money. They have the kind of power that can destroy people's lives before dessert is served. Then it's a good thing I know how to cook, Isabella said, though her stomach was doing gymnastics. What's the worst that could happen? Marco's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his face went even paler. What is it? Isabella asked. Marco showed her the screen. The message was from Valentina. Congratulations on your marriage, darling. I'm sure it will be everything you deserve. Can't wait to meet the new Mrs. Wellington properly. V. That sounds ominous, Giuseppe observed. Everything about my life is ominous, Marco said. But when he looked at Isabella, his expression softened. Are you sure you want to do this? There's still time to get this annulled and find you a nice normal husband who doesn't come with homicidal business partners and sociopathic family members. Isabella looked at her new husband, this complicated, damaged, surprisingly sweet man who'd just legally tied himself to her dreams, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. Marco Wellington, she said, reaching up to straighten his tie. I signed up for better or worse, And if your family wants a fight, they're going to get one. Marco caught her hands as she finished adjusting his tie, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. Have I mentioned that you're either the bravest or most foolish person I've ever met? Both, Isabella admitted. But at least I'm not boring. No, Marco said softly, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her forget they were standing on a public sidewalk. You're definitely not boring. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away. The traffic, Giuseppe's sniffling, David's disapproving presence. It was just the two of them, married and terrified, and completely out of their depth. Then Isabella's phone rang, shattering the moment. She glanced at the unknown number and answered without thinking. Hello? Isabella Santos? The voice was unfamiliar, crisp and professional. It's Wellington now, actually. Who is this? This is Jennifer Martinez from Food and Wine magazine. I'm calling about your marriage to Marco Wellington. We'd love to do a feature story on the new power couple in the culinary world. Isabella looked at Marco, who had gone completely rigid. I'm sorry, she said slowly. How did you get this number? We have our sources. So, when can we schedule the interview? Isabella hung up without answering and stared at her phone as it immediately started ringing again. And so it begins, David said grimly. Marco took Isabella's hand and squeezed it gently. Still think you can handle this? Isabella looked at her new husband, thought about Rosa's food truck and Giuseppe's faith in her, and felt something stubborn and determined settle in her chest. Ask me again after Sunday dinner, she said. 3 months later, Isabella stood in front of Rosa's newly renovated food truck, watching the line of customers that stretched around the block, and wondered when her life had turned into something from a romantic comedy. The truck gleamed in the afternoon sun, its red and white stripes freshly painted. Rosa's Kitchen, written in elegant gold script across the side, with smaller text underneath. Proprietors, Marco and Isabella Wellington. Order up, she called, sliding a steaming plate of homemade ravioli through the service window to a customer who'd been waiting 45 minutes and didn't seem to mind at all. This is insane, Marco said, appearing at her elbow with another tray of his grandmother's secret meatballs. In the 3 months since their wedding, he'd traded his expensive suits for jeans and aprons, learned to work a grill without burning himself, and somehow looked more attractive covered in marinara sauce than he ever had in designer clothing. Good insane or bad insane? Isabella asked, bumping his hip with hers as she passed. A casual intimacy that had developed somewhere between learning each other's coffee preferences and perfecting Rosa's ragu recipe together. The best kind, Marco grinned, then leaned closer to whisper, though I think we have bigger problems than the lunch rush. Isabella followed his gaze to the black town car that had just pulled up across the street. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the occupant stepping out, Charles Wellington, looking like a storm cloud in an Armani suit, and Valentina, elegant and dangerous in head-to-toe Chanel. Right on schedule, Isabella muttered. They'd been expecting this confrontation ever since the Wellington family dinner 3 months ago. The dinner where Isabella had served Charles Wellington homemade lasagna in his own dining room and calmly explained that his son was happier than he'd been in years. Thank you very much. Isabella, Marco's voice carried a note of concern. You don't have to face them. I can handle this. We're partners, remember? Isabella untied her apron and handed it to Giuseppe, who'd insisted on helping with the lunch rush despite claiming he was retired. Besides, I've been looking forward to this conversation for months. Charles Wellington approached the truck with the bearing of a man accustomed to people stepping aside when he walked. Valentina flanked him like a perfectly dressed bodyguard, her dark eyes scanning the crowd of happy customers with obvious disdain. Marco, Charles said without preamble, we need to talk. Dad, Marco replied evenly, not moving from Isabella's side. Fancy seeing you in this part of town. Slumming it with the common folk? Don't be flip with me, son. This charade has gone on long enough. Charles gestured dismissively at the food truck. Playing house with the help is one thing, but you're embarrassing the family name. The board is asking questions I can't answer. Isabella felt Marco tense beside her, but before he could respond, she stepped forward. "Mr. Wellington," she said pleasantly, "how lovely to see you again. Would you like to try our special today? It's Rosa's famous osso buco, made from a recipe that's been in her family for 5 generations. I'm not here for food," Charles snapped. "I'm here to end this ridiculous marriage and bring my son back to reality." "Funny," Isabella said, her voice still sweet, but with an edge of steel underneath. "Because last time I checked, Marco was a grown man, capable of making his own decisions." "Is he?" Valentina finally spoke, her accent more pronounced than usual. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's being manipulated by a gold-digging waitress who saw an opportunity and took it." The crowd around the food truck had gone quiet, sensing drama. Isabella was aware of phones being raised, people starting to record what was clearly about to become a very public confrontation. "Valentina," Marco warned, his voice low and dangerous. "No, it's okay," Isabella said, placing a calming hand on Marco's arm. "Let her talk. I'm curious to hear what she thinks she knows about my marriage." "I know that convenient marriages have convenient endings," Valentina said with a cold smile. "And I know that your little food truck experiment is about to come to a very abrupt halt." "What's that supposed to mean?" Marco demanded. Valentina's smile widened. "Check your permits, darling. Specifically, your health department certification. I'm sure you'll find it interesting." Isabella's blood went cold. She and Marco had been scrupulous about following every regulation, but she knew better than anyone how easy it was to find violations if you looked hard enough, or if you had enough money to make inspectors look harder than usual. "What did you do?" Marco's voice was barely controlled fury. "Nothing illegal," Valentina said innocently. "I simply brought some concerns to the attention of the proper authorities. Concerns about food safety, permit irregularities, tax compliance issues." "You sabotaged us," Isabella said flatly. "I protected the Wellington name from association with a failing business venture run by unqualified amateurs," Valentina corrected. "Though I suppose the distinction is academic now." Charles Wellington stepped forward, his expression almost sympathetic. "Marco, this is what happens when you try to build something on a foundation of lies. Come back to New York. Divorce the girl. Give her whatever she wants to go away quietly, and we'll pretend this never happened." Isabella looked at Marco, watching the conflict play out across his face. For 3 months, they'd been living in a bubble, working together, laughing together, slowly falling in love despite every rational reason not to. But now reality was crashing in, and she could see him retreating into himself, becoming the dutiful son who'd spent his whole life trying to please an unpleasable father. "Marco," she said softly. He turned to look at her, his green eyes full of pain and indecision. "Isabella, maybe they're right. Maybe I've been selfish, dragging you into my family's mess. You could get hurt because of me." "I'm already hurt," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not because of your family. Because you're giving up on us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 months of unspoken feelings and the weight of a marriage that had started as pretense, but had become something real when neither of them was looking. "Us?" Charles Wellington laughed harshly. "There is no us. There's a business arrangement with an expiration date." "Is that what you think?" Isabella turned to face him fully, her fear transforming into fierce protectiveness for the man she'd fallen in love with despite every logical reason not to. "You think I spent 3 months learning every detail of your son's coffee order, staying up until midnight helping him perfect his writing, holding his hand through panic attacks about disappointing you again, all for money?" Charles faltered slightly. What? You think I memorized the way he laughs when he's really happy? Or learned to read his moods by the way he arranges ingredients? Or fell asleep every night wishing our fake marriage could be real because I was after his trust fund? Isabella's voice grew stronger with each word. "Mr. Wellington, I was born in Queens to a single mother who cleaned offices to pay rent. I know exactly what it's like to be broke, and I know exactly what it's like to be rich in all the ways that actually matter. She turned back to Marco, who was staring at her like she'd just revealed the secrets of the universe. Your son matters, she continued, her eyes never leaving Marco's face. Not his money, not his name, not his family's approval. Him. The man who cries at sad movies, who learns new recipes just to see me smile, who quit the life everyone expected him to live because he wanted to build something real with his own hands. The crowd around them had swelled, and Isabella was dimly aware of cameras recording every word, but all she could see was Marco's face as understanding dawned in his eyes. Isabella, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I love you, she said simply. Not the Wellington heir, not the successful businessman, not the convenient husband. You. The man who drove through a thunderstorm to find food made with love, and who taught me that the best ingredient in any recipe is someone who cares whether you're happy. Marco stared at her for a long moment, then started laughing, the kind of deep, joyful laughter she'd learned to recognize as his truest self breaking through years of carefully constructed defenses. You love me, he repeated, like he was testing the words. Apparently so, Isabella said, suddenly shy now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Good, Marco said, stepping closer and cupping her face in his hands. Because I've been in love with you since the day you served me that hamburger and looked at me like I mattered more than my bank account. He kissed her then, right there in front of his father and Valentina and half the neighborhood, and Isabella felt like she was finally home. When they broke apart, Charles Wellington was staring at them with an expression Isabella couldn't quite read. Well, he said finally, this is unexpected. Dad, Marco said, not letting go of Isabella's hands. I know you want what's best for me, but this is what's best for me. She's what's best for me. Charles looked between them, then at the food truck, then at the crowd of customers who were still waiting patiently for their orders, despite the drama. The permits, he said suddenly, turning to Valentina. What exactly did you do? Valentina's composed mask slipped slightly. Charles, I was protecting your interests. What did you do? Charles repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate answers. I may have suggested to certain officials that the truck's certifications deserved closer scrutiny, Valentina admitted reluctantly. Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying the operation around them, the efficient service, the happy customers, the obvious pride Marco and Isabella took in their work. Valentina, he said finally, you're fired. What? Valentina's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. Charles, you can't be serious. We've worked together for 15 years. 15 years during which you've consistently prioritized your own agenda over my family's actual well-being, Charles said coldly. Consider this your notice. He turned back to Marco and Isabella, who were watching the exchange with stunned amazement. As for the permits, Charles continued, I'll make some calls. By tomorrow morning, you'll have every certification you need, along with a formal apology from the health department. Dad, Marco started. I don't pretend to understand this, Charles said, gesturing at the food truck and the life his son had built. But I can see that you're happy. Happier than you've been in years. And if this is what it takes... He paused, looking directly at Isabella. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Wellington. Though I suspect you could have handled us with or without my approval. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Wellington. Charles, he corrected. And perhaps sometime you could show me how to make that lasagna you served at dinner. My wife hasn't stopped talking about it. 6 months later, Isabella stood in the same spot outside Rosa's food truck, but everything had changed. The line was still around the block, but now it included food critics from major publications, tourists following social media recommendations, and regular customers who'd become friends. The truck was the same, but it was joined by 2 others, Giuseppe's Classics and Wellington & Co. Catering. forming a small food truck empire that was currently being featured in every major food magazine in the country. Marco appeared beside her, as he did every day at closing time, and handed her a cup of coffee made exactly the way she liked it. "Good day?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "The best," Isabella said, leaning back against his chest. "Giuseppe sold out of meatballs again. The catering truck has bookings through next month. And that food critic from the Times said we're redefining American comfort food with authentic Italian soul." Marco hummed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And how do you feel about that, Mrs. Wellington?" Isabella turned in his arms to face him, noting the way his eyes still lit up when he looked at her, even after 9 months of marriage. "I feel like Rosa would be proud," she said. "And like we're exactly where we're supposed to be." "Speaking of which," Marco said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box, "I have something for you." Isabella stared at the box. "Marco, what?" "Our contract expires next month," he said, his voice suddenly nervous. "And I was hoping... that is, I was wondering if you might be interested in renegotiating the terms." Isabella opened the box to find a ring that took her breath away. Not because it was expensive, though it clearly was, but because it was perfect. A simple solitaire that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny rainbows. "Marco Wellington," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. "Are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we tear up the old contract and write a new one," Marco said, dropping to one knee right there on the sidewalk. "One with different terms. Like forever, and for love, and because I can't imagine spending another day without you as my real wife." Isabella looked down at this man who'd started as a stranger, become a business partner, and somehow turned into her everything. "What about the food truck clause?" she asked teasingly. "I'm pretty attached to our business partnership." "That's non-negotiable," Marco said solemnly. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me as your partner in all things, Isabella Santos Wellington." "In that case," Isabella said, holding out her left hand, "I accept your terms." As Marco slipped the ring onto her finger, replacing the simple band from their contract marriage with something that represented their real love, Isabella heard Giuseppe cheering from inside his truck and felt a warm breeze that smelled like rosemary and basil. "Thank you, Rosa," she whispered. When Marco kissed her this time, it tasted like coming home, like the future, and like the best ingredient of all. Love, cooked slowly and served with a generous heart. The end